Hey guys, I wanted to come back and have another conversation about hard things, and this one is gonna be what is sexual harassment? I know with Me Too, with everything, a lot of people have read a lot about this, but there's still a lot of confusion out there. And some people come to me and will describe things and say, oh, that clearly wasn't sexual harassment, and then I'll sort of suggest that it was. So I just want to give a little bit of an overview of what sexual harassment really is and what it's not. So there's two ways you want to look at this. One is how do we think of sexual harassment? How do you want to think about it? How do you want to identify it in your life? The second is what is illegal. So I can't give you legal advice in this, but I can sort of give you an overview of generally what the law does and how it looks at sexual harassment. So the first idea is that sexual harassment is unwelcome, offensive conduct. It can be something someone says, or it can be something someone does. So if somebody makes a joke and it's related to sex and you think it's hilarious, it's not sexual harassment probably because it's not unwelcome, because you think it's hilarious. If it's offensive in the way that they say it, it's more likely to be sexual harassment. You may want to think about it as sexual harassment in that situation. So I'm going to say it again. So unwelcome, offensive, verbal or physical conduct. And then it's directed based on gender, like based on because you're a woman or a man or whatever gender you identify as, it's targeting that area. So it doesn't have to be specifically related to sex. It just is about whatever your gender is, because you're a man or a woman or non-binary or transitioning or whatever gender you identify as, targeting you because of that. So then you want to look at, when is harassment illegal? Most sexual harassment is not illegal. And most people don't really know that. So they can get discouraged when they don't get legal help. Just because something's not illegal doesn't mean it's right or okay. It just means that you need another way to address it, that the law can't step in and help necessarily, but you can still do something about it. So sexual harassment is a crime usually, and I'm being really general about this because it's different in every state. So before I talk about what's illegal and what's not, I should say, if you think that you've experienced a crime, you should definitely talk to the police. If you think that you may have a lawsuit, you should talk to a lawyer about your own situation. Don't take what I say as just a general, don't apply it to yourself without talking to a lawyer first. So, okay, but then just as an overview, sexual harassment usually becomes a crime either when someone touches a sexual body part or a private body part of yours, or if you get physically hurt. That tends to be when it becomes a crime, when you're going to want to call the police. So the mistake I see people, like I had someone say to me a little while back, oh, well, they don't understand that like grabbing a woman's butt isn't a crime, when really it is. So if someone's touching you in a sexual body part, you can call the police about that. No one's allowed to touch you if you don't want them to. Then what you look at, so that's the criminal side of it. That's when you want to call the police. But then sexual harassment is also illegal if you experience it at work from your employer. And so there are two types of sexual harassment that you want to look at with that. And we're still looking at the unwelcome, offensive conduct that's based on your gender. So if you're an employee and you are in a job and one of the conditions of your job is that you submit to some kind of offensive conduct related to your gender, that's called quid pro quo sexual harassment. So the way we traditionally think of quid pro quo sexual harassment is kind of like a Mad Men kind of scenario where there's like a secretary and the boss says, you have to have an affair with me or you're fired. Or, like flirts with her and makes that a condition of employment. Usually what quid pro quo, in my experience, what quid pro quo sexual harassment actually looks like is that there are two people working together and they have a pretty close relationship. And then one of them, usually the one in power, decides that they need to have an affair. And I'm going to make generalizations based on gender for this. So I'm going to say the man is the one that's the supervisor and the woman is a support person, right? This is just tends to be the most common scenario, but women can sexually harass men, women can sexually harass women, men can sexually harass men. It's not limited to men being the perpetrator. Anyway, so the typical scenario that you see is the male supervisor falls in love, decides that he's in love with the woman in a less powerful position, and he says, I love you, I can't live without you, I need you to be with me, or we can't work together. And then she is put in a very uncomfortable position because she doesn't want to have a relationship, right? So she decides she has to choose between her job and having this relationship with this guy. Many women don't realize right away that this is sexual harassment because they have this close relationship with the male supervisor. And so they have some compassion around it. But the problem is that women are being forced out of their work, out of their careers, in a way that men are not being forced out of their careers based on this quid pro quo situation where a man in power says, you have to have a relationship with me in order to keep your job. So you want to be aware of this in a way where it doesn't have to look like, it can look like the man genuinely thinks that he's in love, but he's still threatening the woman's job. So that's quid pro quo harassment. It can show up in a lot of different ways. That's just one example. The second, if you're in a job, if you're in a workplace, the second form of sexual harassment that you want to be aware of is hostile work environment sexual harassment. That also can show up in two ways. So the first way for it to show up is sexualized comments, touching, anything that makes the workplace threatening to a woman. Like, you have to listen to people make demeaning jokes about women all day. You have to, your supervisor comes around and gives you a back massage all the time. And so this can show up in a lot of different ways. But it has, in order for it to be illegal in this situation, it has to be severe or pervasive. So severe tends to be like you get physically injured, or just some kind of, it's a not very well defined word, but something where you go, oh my God, that's horrible. And then pervasive is sort of like just daily, everyday kind of demeaning comments or reassignment to bad work, things like that. And so it has to be severe or pervasive before it becomes illegal. In education, if there's a federally funded place of education, those two are kind of the same. There's still the quid pro quo and the hostile environment, sexual harassment. So if you're in a university that's federally funded, that can also be illegal. Most other forms of sexual harassment, most other ways that we encounter it, have not become illegal yet. There's a new thing in France where they're actually making street harassment illegal, so you can get a fine if you harass somebody on the street. And that's because they've realized how much violence comes from a culture where there is pervasive harassment against women. So they want to start stopping that at an early stage. So the other piece I want to talk about, and ask questions if I've missed anything. I know there are a bunch of lawyers who always follow these things, so tell me if I missed something on there too. But the other thing I want to talk about is what the studies show causes sexual harassment. So there's a new study out, I think last week or the week before, from Ohio University. And they did 3 studies, and they looked at what was more likely to make a man in power sexually harass a woman in a lower position. And the one thing that was the key to whether a man was likely to to have sexually harassing behavior was insecurity, which I thought was really interesting. So if a man in power feels insecure about what other people think about him and what his position is in a company, he's more likely to commit sexual harassment. The other thing about that to know is that when women feel insecure in their positions, socially or professionally in a workplace, they're less likely to report sexual harassment. So there was a Harvard Business Review study, I think a couple months ago, and it said that when the public hears about one instance of sexual harassment in a company, it's more likely to think there's a cultural problem in the company than if they hear about one instance of like financial abuse. So the scenarios that people were given were that they heard about a company where like assistant reported that the manager sexually harassed her one time, or they heard a story where an assistant reported that a manager like stole money from the company. When they heard about the financial abuse, they were more likely to think that it was a bad apple situation. And when they heard about the sexual harassment, they were more likely to think that it was a cultural issue. And that's likely accurate based on the other studies. So, but the other thing to know about it is when the public heard that the company had responded effectively and that they had given the woman information and that they had, been responsive to a report, it reduced the public perception of a bad culture to nothing, to less than the financial abuse scenario. So there's a lot we can do to address sexual harassment. Sometimes it's inside of the law and sometimes it's outside of the law. But the thing you always want to do is address the power dynamic between the people where the behavior is happening. So, for example, if a man is feeling insecure in his job, he's more likely to sexually harass. He's feeling like he has an inaccurate perception of, Cresta wants to help too, of the power dynamic that he's experiencing. If a woman is insecure in her job, she's less likely to report sexual harassment or address it herself. So that's going to continue a culture of sexual harassment. So what we need to do as companies, as employers, as employees, is take a look at the power dynamics that are happening in the companies that we're in and address those effectively. So I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, just let me know. And I am gonna put a link in the comments to my book in case people want to read more about this, and you're welcome to download a copy of that. Thank you.